Good morning. So this, well, it's a last lecture, isn't it? Exciting. So today, want to talk sort of a bit about a little bit different topic, sort of that might be quite important for you as well for your thesis. It's about sort of interviews and focus groups and how you conduct those and analyze the data that you gain out of interviews and focus groups. And might come in quite handy for your work on your thesis then as well. Because well, depending on your topic and your needs and your research questions, there might be a chance that conducting an interview or focus group might come in be important for you as well. So basically, it's quite simple. I just found this quote there. Well, basically, if you want to know what people want, what they think, well, you must ask them. It's basically as simple as that. How you ask those things, and how you design your sort of interview and analyze the data. That's sort of there's some specifics, and so we're going to talk about those today. Cool. So basically, interviews and focus groups are all about asking people, and for in HCI, it's most of the time it's users that you ask specific questions. So those interviews basically can serve different purposes, and one you probably you already conducted for your sort of interview you already conducted might have been for your 1 week project. So you probably already have conducted an interview, and that's where you try to sort of do sort of a requirement analysis and ask a user basically. So what do you think of the current prototype? What do you believe should what do you like? What you don't like? What should be changed? And what are your requirements in the end? The main difference between interviews and focus groups is the number of people, and there are more other differences. But the main difference are interviews are one-on-one, so you have one participant and one person that you ask questions, and in focus groups you have many people. Well, compared to other evaluation methods, there's advantages and disadvantages of interviews and focus groups. For example, compared to questionnaires, well, you can ask questions with a questionnaire as well, so that you don't have to ask questions in person. But as you sort of probably can sort of imagine, questionnaires, as we said, they are quite good at getting answers rather quickly from many people, but they're not as good in sort of developing understanding, a more in-depth understanding of a certain topic. And for that, interviews are sort of more appropriate to get more in-depth understanding. And with certain types of interviews, depending on what type of interviews you design, they can be more flexible than questionnaires as well, because once you wrote a questionnaire, it set basically all the questions, and people go through the questions as they are. And with interviews, you have more flexibility. Well, the disadvantages, it's not just sitting there with a person and asking them. There's sort of a whole process, and it requires some skill and some knowledge, basically, that you have to build up to really do this appropriately, those interviews. It requires more time and resources than questionnaires normally. And you have sort of the similar issues like sometimes with questionnaires. So if you ask questions, there's always the potential problem of people having to sort of recall there, and then you potentially introduce sort of an aspect, sort of, or just some reasoning. People try to think back. Okay, well, how often did I use my cell phone over the last week? Oh, I don't know, probably, 5 times a day or whatever. So there's always a potential issue of sort of recall problems that people can't recall their usage patterns, for example. So, like with all other evaluation approaches and methods, it's always a good idea to combine different types of evaluation methods together and try to triangulate your sort of measures and observations, and try to combine basically your findings and results from the different methods. And I found this quote as well, sort of look at behavior and listen to perceptions. So sometimes it might be quite helpful to combine interviews with direct observations as well. Then you get less of those recall problems, but you can really look at see how people use a certain your interface or or how they appreciate your new design, for example. In the end, you can use interviews at all stages of your research. You can use them sort of in quite early stages for more sort of exploratory digging sort of a little bit in sort of the dirt type of inquiry. So this would be just basically to get a better understanding of a topic area. So if you're quite new to a certain topic area and you want to get just a understanding how people use a certain type of technology, it can be quite a good idea to start sort of inquiring with people directly, because you probably don't have enough expertise and knowledge to already embark on a more structured evaluation. It's quite probably difficult to, in early stages, to already come up with a good questionnaire, for example. So in early stages, it can be quite helpful to design some interviews and to conduct some interviews or focus groups. And it also can help basically to form your further research. So, if, normally to find sort of a research topic or research question, what do you normally do? You read papers, for your topic. You try to find if there's some unresearched area that you're interested in, and try to sort of, through background research, formulate basically research questions. And as part of this background research, interviews can be quite helpful as well to help you get a better understanding of the research topic and try to formulate research questions. So can be quite helpful in those initial stages, those interviews. As we said, if you have sort of already quite a good idea, or you have sort of initial prototype, or you want to improve on upon a design, you can use interviews and focus groups for more sort of in-depth requirement analysis, what you probably have done for your 1-week project already. And can also be sort of used, and sometimes it's used sort of in later stages as well. So there's part of a sort of a more sort of formative or summative evaluation. Most of the time, it's not then used as sort of as a sole method, but just in combination with other methods. Like you can do your lab study, for example, and then after people went through sort of your study, completed the study and all your tasks, it's sometimes can be a good idea to include sort of an interview as well. So to combine basically some more structured measurements, task measurements with some subjective feedback from people as well through an interview.
How do you do triangulation between sort of structured between those two types?
Well, this can be, for example, if you find people struggling with, if they have to solve sort of a task with your interface. I don't know, you have to click, either reaction time or whatever, And for example, if you find people struggling with certain things, an interview can help you get a better understanding why
they struggle
with a certain thing. I guess you can use this as sort of a complement somehow to get a sort of a better understanding of why things happened, or if you compare interfaces, for example, and you get people to rate the interfaces afterwards, just which one did you like best, or rate from 1 to 3, or rate the 3 interfaces, whatever, from 1 to 3, which you like best. This doesn't give you yet a good understanding why they like one or the other interface better, and an interview can give you a better understanding why they like the certain interface better. You also can do this with a comment, for example. You can ask people, please rate the interfaces and include sort of a text box. Please comment on why you preferred one interface over the other. This sort of can be done as well, but sometimes what you might find that people give you a more in-depth answer verbally rather than written. Sometimes people don't like to write sort of long paragraphs, so they just want to get and sort of it's just longer to do it sort of written. And sometimes people give you more or different kinds of answers verbally then as well. As you said, well, most of the times it's users that you invite for interviews or focus groups, but you also can think basically beyond sort of just the potential user groups for interviews or focus groups. So what we did, for example, we did some studies with sort of using augmented reality in educational settings. There's like a Magic Book, you've by now probably have seen a lot of those demos. And so we did some studies on using sort of the Magic Book idea in schools with with students and sort of especially younger students, and to get sort of a better understanding of how we can set up those studies and how we can develop those educational experiences to some extent. What we did frequently is invite teachers to the lab. We showed them sort of different demos, and especially Magic Book demos, and then had a focus group to sort of try to discuss basically where they see potential benefits, or what, for example, topic areas could be beneficial for us to look into for sort of developing those AR experiences. Because in the end, we are not, especially I'm, for example, I'm not an educator. I'm not an expert in educating students. School students especially, I guess. So in the end, that helped us to get a better understanding of which topic areas we could teach with those Magic Books, especially for primary students. So in the end, just think about sort of for interviews, especially if you're in early stages. If you're in early stages of your research, whoever sort of might be affected by the system could give you sort of, who can give you some valuable information for you to design the system, or do sort of for your research in general. Key informants for us in this particular example. Those were sort of the teachers. Sometimes it can be quite difficult to get direct access to certain user groups. And then sort of an intermediate person can be quite helpful to get sort of... I'm just thinking about a while ago, sort of I attended a talk by a guy. Does research in the University of South Africa, and he does quite a lot of research on how lower income African people use cell phones, and they do quite a lot of field work, and he did some work in Kenya, for example, as well, with sort of African tribes. And for the researchers, it was quite difficult to get access to people in those tribes, because it's quite difficult to get sort of into the, let's say, the circle of trust somehow. And what they used those some key informants to be sort of a proxy between people in those villages and the researchers, and that was sort of apparently quite helpful process to have those proxies somewhere sitting in the middle, because otherwise they wouldn't have had the chance to get access to those. This probably, not so far away, probably can happen here as well, depending, if you, for example, do research with some clinical populations, or disabled people, for example. It can be probably quite difficult for you to get direct access to those user groups as well, and their key informants or some proxy people in between can be quite helpful for you as well to get access basically to information. Are there any other areas that you could think of? Well, anytime sort of you find it, just try to think a little bit out of, not just the user group, but who else could be helpful to give you access to the information and to people. So there are different types of interviews. You can have fully structured, semi-structured, or unstructured interviews. The fully structured interview would have a set of questions that you go through, and you try to stick to those questions. Well, you might think, well, then how is that different from a questionnaire again? And to some extent, it's not that different from a questionnaire. It's just basically a questionnaire done by a researcher. A semi-structured interview would have sort of a set of questions, but some flexibility in how you proceed basically throughout the interview. So you have some flexibility on asking follow-up questions or not. And this fully structured, you should not basically, you should stick to the path basically you defined. And an unstructured interview basically doesn't have a already formulated set of questions, but you have a certain topic area in mind and just embark on your interview and try to gather information quite sort of, as it said, unstructured. And, well, again, sort of there's advantages, disadvantages to all those approaches. Is it me or is it? So, well, the more structure you have, the easier it is basically for you to sort of conducting and interpreting the results, because it's the more structure, the more straightforward it is basically to run it and to analyze the results afterwards, because and to compare basically different users, but you're sacrificing a little bit, potentially getting more in-depth insight into the topic area. So as we said, sort of the fully structured interviews, you stick to your script. You can sort of basically afterwards run some statistics on it. For example, descriptive statistics. We say such and such % of users found the interface to be crap, whatever. On such 50% thought it sort of it's quite easy to use. That's what you can do with more sort of fully structured interviews, but not so much. Well, you still can do it to some extent with less structured interviews, but it gets a little bit more challenging. As you said, although it's sort of a already presented survey, people probably give you more in-depth answers to your questions rather than if they have to write. So there is certain advantages doing it orally over a written a questionnaire. But you can't follow up on unplanned or include unplanned questions with a fully structured interview. For the semi-structured interview, you have sort of questions that sort of serve as a starting point for you, but then you can digress from your script as well. For an unstructured interview, you certainly have sort of some initial questions, to sort of break the ice and just get the ball rolling. But then it's more you sort of try to explore basically while you do the interview. It can be quite difficult basically to conduct those interviews and to keep sort of on track and not to try to sometimes things digress quite quickly. So it takes some of your sort of skills to try to still keep it in sort of certain confines. Well, depending on what you want to get out of it. If you think it's completely okay to digress completely, well, you probably get certain information, but potentially less about a certain topic you're interested in. So it needs for you some skill to sort of manage the interview a little bit. Well, it's more involving on your side rather than a fully structured interview.
What about some combinations of those types? So, like, have part of your interview being, say, semi-structured, the part being fully structured. Is that
well, sure, definitely. Well, sort of a semi-structured interview is sort of the combination to a certain extent anyway. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so you have a set of questions that you don't want to digress from, and then you have another set of questions which you're very happy to digress.
Well, definitely, yeah. Well, that's certainly possible.
You could address the first part with like a questionnaire initially, and after the questionnaire you go into an informal analysis.
Because that has the benefit of
you. Well, it's certainly possible. You just have to keep in mind potential time. If you don't want to have interviews that take up 2 hours, and there's also the potential that your initial structured questions already sort of to some extent bias the unstructured part afterwards, because you already anchor people in a certain way, in a certain mindset potentially. So you have probably to be careful about sort of if your part, the first part potentially influences the second part. But certainly it's certainly something you can think of doing.
Suppose if you have a structured interview and in the end you have a question saying additional thoughts or your additional, so would that, just because of that question, would the whole interview would be a structured one or semi-structured?
Well, I think in the end, those are definitions. It's not that it's basically it's more definitions for you to sort of think along sort of certain lines. It's in the end, if you have sort of a structured interview and additional questions afterwards, you still can think of it as a structured interview because it can have sort of comments on a questionnaire as well. You could say it's a semi-structured. So in the end, it doesn't really, to some extent, the exact definition doesn't really matter that much. It's more what you make out of it, I guess. In the end, like all the evaluation procedures, there are tools in your toolbox. In the end, it really comes to you to try to find the appropriate approach to choose to get an answer for your problem or for your research question to some extent. It's just probably not a three. See it on a continuum to some extent. You have sort of fully structured there and fully unstructured there, and try to find where along this continuum you sit comfortably.
I guess
it's just just keep in mind the less structure you have, the more involving it can be to run the interview and to analyze the data afterwards. But there's also the potential of getting more in-depth answers to your problem. Well, for those contextual interviews, it's sometimes you can not just ask questions, but try to get some props or your prototype in as well, and combine basically either, just demonstrate what we did, for example, within the focus group with the magic books, demonstrate the technology and to get people a better idea of what you're talking about. Because sometimes if we talk to the teachers about, we have those magic books, augmented reality, and what do you think of it? They probably wouldn't have sort of a clue. Well, some probably would have, others probably wouldn't have a clue what we're talking about. So sometimes it can be good to include demonstration of the technology as well. Sometimes, you don't have to even show the technology per se or a prototype, but you can include other. You can have paper prototypes, for example, showing, So it doesn't have to be a polished product that you show. It can be a prototype. It can be just a prop. It can be pictures, photos, or whatever. And this can be either demonstrated to the people, or you can even ask people to, give it a go, and then combine sort of observation and interviews, interview techniques as well. So it can be either serve as a trigger to get initial ideas, or to get some already some observations under the hood. Well, as you said, sort of interviews might be more sort of common for you. You probably have, as I said, or you probably already have already conducted some interviews. They certainly take time, and if you interview several people, it takes even more time. So focus groups, and especially for analyzing the results, we're going to talk about this afterwards again. This certainly takes even more time than the actual interview itself. So keep that in mind. It depends on what type of interview you have, but if you have sort of unstructured interviews and have to transcribe text or video or audio, this can take a considerable amount of time. So keep that in mind as well when you plan your interview or your focus groups.
Does that scale linearly? The more people you have, should you just multiply the time by you as you would for one person? Or?
I guess it really depends on probably some interviews are, it depends on what you do. If you transcribe, for example, audio, some are probably easier to do than others. Sometimes you probably don't understand a certain, people there. So you can't really say okay, it's just a linear thing, Sometimes it's really more difficult, not just on an audio basis, just on a conceptual basis, to make sense of, of what a person said.
But generally, it takes more time to analyze than it does to do an interview.
Oh, certainly, yeah. Well, some say it can take up to 10 times as much time. It really depends on, I guess, what you do. So it can certainly take a lot of time. So focus groups. Well, one potential advantage is that you get answers from several people at the same time. So you don't have to run one-on-one sessions. So you can, the numbers, different researchers argue on different numbers. So some say you should have a max of 8 people. Some say, you can have 8 to 12 people at once, but the group shouldn't be too big, because you run into all kinds of problems with big groups. Managing the groups and getting all people involved in discussions it becomes more and more complicated the bigger the groups are. Well, focus group, some advantages, disadvantages. Well, one advantage, as I said, you have multiple people at the same time, and you get answers from different perspective. Well, people with different perspective at the same time. And the other thing that can happen, that sort of answers from certain people trigger basically answers of other people. People stimulate each other in group discussions, and that doesn't happen in interviews. Because it's one-on-one. So group discussions or basic people bouncing off ideas each other, this can't happen in interviews. And so that can be quite helpful for in focus groups. So again, in our example, it was really interesting to see how the teachers basically bounced off ideas of each other. Where it's like, okay, I can imagine, it could be used. Well, some said it could be used for, a virtual orchestra where you can, zoom into certain instruments and just get a sort of better idea of that, and think, that's great. And so they just bounced off ideas, and it was sort of quite a rich outcome in the end. But on the other hand, this can also be a downside, because there's also always the potential to get tinted answers from people. There's always group dynamics, and as you sort of appreciate, in certain groups there's leaders and not so much leaders, and so there's always the potential that some people with strong opinion can sort of dominate the discussion, and other people probably don't voice their opinion as freely as they would sort of in an interview. So that there's always the potential that you get certain bias in answers through sort of those. In such focus groups. So it's basically up to you as a researcher to manage the group dynamics. And that can be quite challenging, because you have to keep track of the content, what people say. You probably have to take notes, and you have to manage the group as well. So sometimes it can be quite helpful to have a second researcher or a second person on board, and someone who just manages the content, takes notes, and another person who manages the group and the group dynamics. Well, normally can't be fully structured as an interview, because if it was fully structured, you had to ask each person the same questions around the table, and then that somehow defeats the purpose of a focus group. So there's certainly less structure than in an interview, because you actually want to have sort of cross-pollination of people. Well, you probably get through less questions because there's group discussions, so you can't ask as many questions. Go sort of probably in another kind of depth for your question. And and one other sort of potential problem can be how to select groups and group participants. So do you want to have a homogeneous group where people are sort of with this similar backgrounds are part of your group? Or do you want to have sort of a multifaceted, multidisciplinary group, for example? And this, really depends on, on your specific problem. Where sort of either a homogeneous group or sort of a multidisciplinary group can be more beneficial. Well, and the other potential disadvantage is getting people at the same time to the same place. So it's more a it's more of a logistics problem than an interview, because an interview can be more flexible in time and arranging time with people. For a focus group, you have a lot less flexibility, as you sort of can imagine. Types of questions. We talked about sort of different types of questions already with the questionnaires, and I guess a lot of this applies to interview questions as well. As you can have close-ended questions, you can have open-ended questions. You can well, similar to sort of a Likert type of scale or to a rating scale. You can ask people, could you please rate your experience on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being sort of worst and 10 being best. So you can have those types of questions in interviews apparently as well. Again, easy to analyze, but probably less informative than open-ended questions. And other sort of potential issues, you can sort of go through the slides for the questionnaires as well. Sort of just be aware of how the question you formulate can potentially influence the results or the answer. And that becomes even more challenging if you do a fully unstructured interview, because then you have to come up with the questions on the fly. And then you have to think about sort of all those potential issues and how you formulate the questions on the fly as well. So it can be sort of quite challenging, in sort of to do sort of a fully unstructured questionnaire, unstructured interview, because you run into potential problems with biasing people through your questions. And again, if you like, did you like my prototype? And it's it's the likelihood's probably of asking those questions in an unstructured interview are probably higher than with a structured interview or semi-structured interview.
You could probably ask a more a detailed question about the prototype, which would sort of alleviate, because you're just asking whether or not they like the overall thing.
You can follow up with sort of, you certainly can do follow-up questions.
I probably wouldn't ask that initially at all.
No, but I think the point I wanted to make of, it's sometimes if it's a lot easier to stumble over such questions in an unstructured interview. Not that you have planned to do it, but you just while you're sort of on the go, it's probably easier to make mistakes along the way. Yeah, because it just happens if you're talking. You don't think too much, probably not as much about sort of. You need some metacognitive skills, someone sitting sort of in there to sort of keep you on track, I guess.
You could probably just sort of pre-plan it in a way like, I can ask these sorts of questions, but I shouldn't ask this question because I know it's going to bias.
Well, definitely. So the more work you do in sort of before that, and you still can have sort of a list, probably a potential list of questions or sort of a cheat sheet where that you can go through. And then again, you can say like, is it in a semi-structured or not? Again, I think whatever serves your purpose in the end, And again, if you see it more of a continuum rather than then you certainly can have your some questions that you can either choose to include or not, or change sort of slightly depending on sort of the situation. Yeah. Well, and again, it's you don't have to just ask questions, but you can use other types of questions as well. If it's like if you ask the user, for example, to complete a sentence, that can be something like that can be used as well. Sort of my favorite feature in this new interface was please complete, for example. Well, and sort of what sort of the conceptual mapping. This can be sometimes useful as well. If people struggle explaining basically concepts, you ask them, could you just sketch basically? I can't switch off the sound here. That's it. The HDMI. That's why. So just draw pictures or sketches, to explain basically. Because sometimes I find it quite, if I explain something, find it a lot easier to, or helpful to have something, to sketch down as well. And this can be used as a sort of as a tool in your interview as well. Just let people sketch and draw. Again, try to ask simple questions. Try to avoid abbreviations, jargon, and those types of things. Try to keep it simple. So in the end, you want people to understand what you're asking them. Compound questions, not so good as well. And similar as we sort of what we talked about last time, sort of try to avoid certain hot topics, topic or words, and sort of judgmental phrases and the such. And well, what you mentioned earlier, you know, you can certainly, and what you should sort of formulate questions depending on answers, basically, of people then as well. So it can be either follow-up questions or you know, just it's sort of the more unstructured you do it, the more sort of live it gets to some extent, and you know, it's more in the end again for you to get more in-depth understanding of a certain topic. And sort of, well, one way of embarking on your sort of journey would be probably to get some, you know, structured or semi-structured interviews under your belt first before you know, embark on a sort of more unstructured interviews, and just to get more experience and some more comfortable with the process. And well, like with everything, pilot testing, it's probably always, it's always a good idea to pilot test your questionnaires with potential participants or just with colleagues, you know, to get sort of more confidence in conducting, in the initial, just getting more confidence in general, conducting interviews. And if you have a specific interview, just get sort of try to get everything right, the questions, and sort of to some extent the structure of your interview. Well, write everything as you can, as much as you can. Write it down on your sort of either on a cheat sheet. Write down questions. Write down sort of what do you do, potential follow-up questions. What do you do if you digress, and those type of things. Try to sort of offload your brains as much as possible, and try to write down instructions for yourself and questions. Well, backups, very important, very important. So don't rely on sort of technology too much, as you probably have experienced through sort of us sort of recording lectures here. There's always things that can happen, especially if you record your interview. And it's probably a good idea to record the interview as well, not just rely on notes as sort of the only recording. But even if you don't plan to analyze or to transcribe the audio or video afterwards, even if you don't plan to do this, it's probably still a good idea as a backup to record an interview, either with just the audio or video, because it just gives you the option of going back if you didn't understand something specifically. It gives you the option to go back and listen to or look at the sort of the some sections then again.
Do you have to worry about ethics, the approval and things like that?
Well, you certainly have to ask the participants first. If
yeah. But what I mean is that if you use the ethics committee, that kind of thing, to do an interview. I know you have to do it for an experiment, but what about just for
Well, in the end, for everything, where you include people, you have to ask ethics.
Cool.
So it's not just for experiments. In the end, every time when you do something with participants, that's sort of the official procedure to ask for ethics approval. And the ethics approval, it can be more straightforward if you don't use recording equipment. If you use recording equipment, what you certainly have to do is ask for permission and informed consent about recording, and just informing the people as well what you use the recordings for and in what context they are used. And so the one hand, it's a good idea to back up, or have sort of multiple sources of sort of recordings and notes, video or audio, still photographs, whatever. And if you do this, try to have batteries and probably a spare video camera, whatever, on hand as well. So, stuff can just go wrong, batteries run out, and such. It's always good idea to have sort of spare tools, I guess. And even if you take notes, have spare pens. It happens so often that a pen just runs out of ink, whatever. Have spare pens, have spare paper, and everything. Can I have sort of a coffee break in a minute? So notes. Always a good idea to take notes on paper. Even if you choose to audio or video record, it's always a good idea to make notes, because sometimes things that you just that really you find important to note down, and that you probably don't get through audio or video. It's quite a good idea to note this down, sort of on a piece of paper, or just some observations or some comments you find really interesting. Either you don't get it through other channels, or it gives you sort of an anchor point to where you want to go back. It's like, okay, this was sort of half an hour through the interview. He really said something important. I want to listen to that again. Just makes it a lot easier to find this again in the recording then, for example, as well. It's always a good idea to take notes. It can be quite challenging to take notes and listen at the same time. So again, you want to find a balance between not just, writing down the notes and just not listening or not paying attention to your interview participant. So it can be quite challenging, but it's still a good idea to try to take notes of important things during the interview. And sort of record insights, verbal, non-verbal responses, everything you really find sort of, okay, this is, this helps me. This really helps me in my sort of analysis. And very important, try to summarize your notes as soon as possible after the interview. Because as you probably can appreciate, notes can be very cryptic after a while. Mine most of the times are, and especially if you take notes while listening, you don't write full sentences, so they can be quite cryptic, and they certainly make sense in a context, but out of context they probably don't make that much sense anymore. So try to summarize or to bring them in another format as soon as possible after the interview, because then when it's still fresh. Because there's those quite interesting lines of forgetting things, and you tend to forget most rather quickly after the event took place. So just as a separate note, try to do this as quickly as possible. Should we have a quick coffee break? So. To try to wrap this up. So as we said, recordings it's always a good idea to have at least backup recordings, even if you don't plan to analyze the recordings as well. But sometimes you actually might be interested in transcribing the recordings as part of your analysis. And this certainly can take a lot of hours. So when we talked earlier about can take up to 10 hours analyzing data in depth, that certainly comes into play. If you do transcribe recordings, that takes a long time, and that you have to go through the recordings not just once but probably several times to get everything right. Depends if you do sort of just verbatim, just everything, just one-to-one transcription or not. So it really depends on what your requirements are and what you want to do. Video can be, the audio might be transcribed just as text. Video can be analyzed as well. You can try to analyze nonverbal behavior through video or other occurrences. Really, again, depends on what your requirements are and what you want to get out of it. But even takes more time and is a lot more involving. What you also can do, you can have audio and still pictures if you don't want to have sort of full video recording. Can be sufficient sometimes. Again, if you want to record sessions, interviews, always ask for consent and that people know what you're doing and what you're doing with the data afterwards. Try to be consistent for comments after you stop the recording. Are they still part of the interview or not? That's something for you to decide, but be consistent about it. Just shouldn't have some comments then include and some you don't include because you don't like them. Just try to be as consistent as possible. So during the interview, it's always a good idea to sort of try to build rapport, verbal and non-verbal rapport. Try to be sort of friendly, respectful, non-judgmental. In the end, what you want to do, you want to create a comfortable environment for yourself and for your participant. Nobody should feel uncomfortable, because that doesn't serve anybody, I guess. Don't try to buy through body language. So what does that mean? Either that, if some comment, doesn't agree with you, which is like cringe and stuff. So try to keep a poker face as much as possible, even if you don't agree with opinions. If you start to sort of shake your head or cringe, that certainly can bias answers. So try to be as vigilant as possible on those things and sort of non-judgmental. So before you conduct an interview, give a sort of a brief introduction, an overview of sort of what's going to happen. Complete all your paperwork, inform consent and such. And just start with sort of introductory, simple questions, icebreakers. Could be, just again, you don't want to really, already just really dive into it and scare off people in the beginning. Just try sort of to have the simple, easy questions in the beginning and harder questions probably later on in the interview. Be flexible if your intended structure allows for it. Try to keep things on track as much as possible. Sometimes it can be quite helpful to explain why you ask a certain question as well. So it's just you can say like, okay, this is now a really important question for us to get a better understanding of how you feel about the interface, and then just it can sort of lead into just give more context to the person as well for some questions. It really depends on the question, but if it's important to give context to a certain question, it can be quite a good idea to explain why you asked the specific question. If you have to use specific technical terms or jargon, explain what that means. And if you don't understand a certain answer, it's feasible. It's certainly possible to ask for clarification, because otherwise the answer doesn't help you anyway. So it's certainly allowed to ask for clarification. So like, okay, what exactly do you mean when you say you didn't understand whatever this interaction metaphor with a prototype? And in general, your task is more to listen rather than talk. So you as a host, if it's necessary, ask questions and sort of ask for clarification, but don't try to talk too much and bring in your opinion. And well, try to sort of read between the lines of, try to get a sense if the interview really tells you what they believe, or if they just try to please you. And well, sometimes it's probably easier than on other occasions to get a sort of get an idea about this, if that happens or not. If that happens, certainly make a note of it. If you just think, so this might have been sort of more an opinion rather than sort of a real answer. Just make a note on your paper, and either then try to deal with that in your analysis, to not interpret this answer or give it too much weight, or you could try to rephrase the question or not try to clarify then as well. But you have to be careful with those types of things. But potentially just try to rephrase the question slightly and sort of dig a little bit deeper. For focus groups, so again, the real challenge with focus groups is sort of managing the group dynamics. And sometimes it can, as I said, it can be helpful to have sort of a second person to help you out with managing the groups, and especially somebody who has already some experience with managing focus groups, and have some plans of how do you want to deal with sort of digressions, arguments, or with, I say, sort of opinionated or sort of strong leaders in a group. Because what you want to do, you want to give everybody a chance to talk and to give an answer and to be part of the discussion. And sometimes, well, you can't force it, obviously, and sometimes people just don't have an opinion, don't want to talk, or are just shy. But you can still try to get, elicit an answer from, or just sort of something from those people as well. For example, could be just by directly addressing them, and say like, Rahul, could you, what do you think about the topic? Could you please give sort of a quick comment about what you believe, and that sort of, so you can try to sort of to get people who are not that talkative to sort of be part of the discussion as well, and that's your job, to try to include everybody in the discussion. Well, sometimes they probably just don't want to talk, don't want to discuss. Could be either demotivated, tired, or well, they just don't want to talk about it. Again, there's not so much you can do in the end, unfortunately. Well, you can try to rephrase the question, or, for example, set the context. You say like, okay, so at work, for example, if how do you solve those tasks at work or at home? Try to set sort of the question in a different context that it potentially makes more sense to the interview partner or to the focus group, people in the focus group. Because sometimes they probably just can't think of an answer to your question, and by rephrasing it or setting it into a different context might make it easier to answer or to start a discussion on a topic. You can use, as we discussed earlier, props or probes, introduce those to trigger basically ideas. It's like, okay, either demonstrate stuff and say like, okay, so what do you think of this technology? Or have people try or have people use those props, for sort of trying to trigger basically a discussion. And quite important after either interview or focus, or after both interview and focus group, is sort of a debriefing session as well. So where you ask you sort of for final comments, You then, only after you finish, basically can provide sort of more details about sort of your research goals. Sometimes you don't want to do this in the beginning, not to sort of pre-bias people already, but it would be probably quite a good idea to do this after, in a debriefing session, basically. You can try to, in focus group, for example, try to summarize your initial sort of notes and findings quickly, and can serve as sort of clarification when you say like, okay, today we talked about this topic, and we had comments on blah blah blah. So, and then you can already get some feedback where people say like, no, this was actually not what I intended, or yeah, okay, now I really agree with that, with this summary, basically. Say thanks. Well, quite obvious, but in the end, you're inviting people to be part of, to give you valuable information for your research, and so they are your customers in the end, and sort of it's simple thanks or giving out some incentives. That's the time to do this afterwards. And well, respond to questions, and that and if something or sometimes focus groups, if they can get a little bit hairy with comments or sort of the group dynamics, and try to sort of clarify those things, or sort of in the debriefing session then as well, that nobody leaves with sort of a sour taste afterwards. That can be quite important then as well, and that's what sort of, so debriefing can be quite important for those, for interviews in focus groups. And again, for yourself, that's not part of the debriefing, reflect on your notes immediately afterwards. Well, the whole thing can be done not just in person, but via telephone or online as well. And we're not talking too much about this today. It just has sort of a different dynamic and different advantages, disadvantages. So, either telephone or online, there's a lack of sort of, for you sort of getting an idea of body language. So you just have less input channels, I guess. So you can't, you don't get an idea about sort of body language. There is basically, on the pro side, there's, apparently it's probably can be easier to get participants, time or sort of just time-wise or sort of location-wise, it can be easier. But on the potential downsides is then again, the pacing can be more difficult. So it depends. If you do it online, you can do it sort of synchronous or asynchronous. It can be either via email or via sort of a chat service. But then again, you get people. You just get a different dynamics. Even if it's sort of synchronous, people have probably more time to think about it and sort of rationalize their answer. So if I ask you something, people can start typing, say like, no, that's not what I wanted to type. No, just go back. Okay. No, that's my answer. They just have more time to think about or potentially rationalize their answers, which can be positive or negative. But just be aware of it, that the answer, the quality of the answer might be different from a face-to-face interview.
Why is it on the cont?
Yeah. It certainly can be pro and con, but you have to be sort of aware of those things. Okay, some notes on data analysis. Again, depends on what kind of interview or focus group, especially interview or focus group you conduct. The more structure, as we said, the more structure you have, the easier analysis will be for you. Easier, more straightforward. Because, what you can do, just run descriptive statistics on it. You can plot graphs, pie graphs, where you say, like, out of my sort of 20 participants, 15, were quite happy with the new interaction flow, and 5 just had problems with it, for example. So it can be a lot easier, I guess. For less structure, avoid what's called sort of cherry picking, because if you have sort of cherry picking in terms of giving more weight to answers that serve your purpose, or so that sort of work towards your hypothesis, I guess. That's so. There's always the potential, because the analysis is a lot more subjective with interviews and focus groups. There's always sort of a potential of sort of subjectivity in your data analysis, and try to be sort of as aware of that as possible, and to be honest to yourself and as possible. Because in the end, you don't really serve anybody by intentionally biasing your results, because then you probably you wasted your time and the time of all your people you invited for your interviews. If you just want to find confirmation for what you already want to have, then then what's the point of going through the trouble of conducting interviews and doing those things? So just in everybody's interest, try to be sort of as sort of unbiased and sort of subjective to some extent as possible. And that's sort of a skill you have to sort of try to reflect on your analysis as much as possible, and trying to probably get outside opinions in as well. So open-ended questions, again, sort of more the more unstructured either in a structured interview you have open-ended questions, or otherwise, it's just, the more unstructured, the more open-ended, basically, the question and answers will be normally. You can choose to either transcribe audio, not just transcribe everything, and then there's even tools that sort of text analysis tools that can go through your notes and, for example, look for certain wordings or whatever, and just extract wordings, for example. When it took written notes, so what do you do with your written notes? How do you incorporate those into the analysis? That's something you have to decide as well. And again, try to do this as soon as possible after you ran your interview. And as we said, requires considerably more time and effort to do sort of analyze open-ended questions rather than close-ended questions.
So with handling your own written notes, there can be quite a bit of variation in the notes that you make based on the questions you have. What are some of the approaches that someone might take in analysing the notes that they make? I mean, do you categorize them?
Yep.
Do you
So that's what we sort of we're going to talk sort of a little bit now. For a more in-depth understanding about sort of those steps, I'd recommend you to read there's a chapter in the book as well about qualitative analysis. So this is just a quick summary of those of sort of ideas in this chapter. But if you want to have sort of more in-depth understanding, it's a good idea to have a look through this chapter. And for even more in-depth information, there is sort of links or references to other resources as well. So with a qualitative analysis in general, what the idea is to find basically a common structures or themes in your data. So you want to just identify important ideas that repeatedly arise during the interview, because that sort of points towards sort of potentially an important issue. So you can either sort of categorize or count frequencies of terms, or sort of frequency of certain patterns in your notes or in the transcriptions. So this can be either done, you can just note down the frequency and say like, okay, well, let's say 50% of my participants commented on the difficulties with touch interaction, for example. Even so, you try to find from those unstructured answers, reoccurring issues. And when you say like, okay, 50% commented on those types of things or those problems, then that might be something important to note. And then you can count, for example, a frequency or occurrences.
Wouldn't that be quantitative if you say 50%?
Well, yeah. Well, it's quantitative when sort of the statement you make, but sort of the analysis of it, it's you still, to some extent, yes, it's sort of somewhere on the border between quantitative and qualitative, but the qualitative part is trying to make sense of the data, I think, because you're sort of dealing with a different type of data, and sort of the first step, it's certainly qualitative because it tries to make sense of the data and try to identify those issues.
So it's just a quantitative measure of the qualitative analysis.
Sort of, yeah, exactly, yeah. For categorization, so you can either start with a certain, well, if you have already a good idea about the topic area, you can, or if prior research already has defined some categories, or for example, interaction categories or the like, you can start with an already predefined set of categories and see, okay, how do the answers fit into those categories, and try to categorize the data with that, or you can try to come up with your own category system and framework. And I think we're going to talk about this in the next slide. So basically what you can do, you go through one or two cases, try to find those reoccurring issues, and try to find sort of meaningful categories. And then go through more through more cases, see if this sort of if this sort of category system still fits. And then you still can try to either stick with that or just try to refine the category system then slightly as well, and just try sort of more an iterative process to define your category framework. So the content analysis, and that's again in more depth described in this chapter, is sort of a systematic approach to finding sort of, well, what in the end, what you want to do with those analysis steps, you want to, you want to decrease complexity. Yeah. You want to basically, you start with a lot of complexity because with all the answers, and what do you want to do? You want to decrease the complexity and try to find basically common themes, and you just want to make it more, handle the data differently and describe the data to someone else. And that's what in the end, you want to then either put words into categories or certain topics into categories, and try to find important issues that you can talk about, and can then be either done by putting quantities around those issues, or can do it purely qualitatively when you say this. In general, we found this as an issue in our analysis. Well, it depends. You can do both. As we said, so for sort of if you analyze text data, you can either start from a existing coding scheme, and this can be either derived from prior research or from your knowledge about the topic area, and then you try to sort of find how the data fits into this category scheme. Or sort of more sort of what's called sort of emergent coding is that that sort of either you or sort of multiple coders identify those coding categories based on sort of a small subset of data, and then if you have multiple coders, you after each of you going through sort of one or two cases can discuss basically, okay, that's what I sort of found in this data, and that's what I would sort of define as a as sort of a category scheme or category list. And if you, if multiple coders agree on that, then you can embark on sort of analyzing your data in more depth. And as I said, it can be an iterative process, just refining the category system. Yeah. So again, finding those coding categories, either through prior research or through your the theoretical framework you developed. So that sort of defines, that can define those categories. So what can you look out for in text? For example, what can be quite important to look out for? Well, it can be objectives, like use of computers for educational purposes. It can be actions, enter passwords, for example. It can be outcomes, success or failure. It can be consequences. So what happens if you, in this example, unintentionally delete an item? Causes for example, errors. Can be limited memory. Contexts. So in this example, the user is computer savvy, or the user works with certain types of information. That sets basically answers can sort of set answers in context, or sort of, for example, strategies. And to ensure sort of high quality and validity in your analysis. Again, it might be a good idea to triangulate data sources and analysis. So try to find as much information sort of that corroborates your arguments as possible. And if you can do this in a paper, and you can say like, okay, we found this through, we found that our new interaction technique works a lot better than others, or people really prefer this interaction technique, and we found this through comments, a questionnaire, and hard facts, usage data. Then it just makes for a lot stronger argument than if you just can find answers through one data source on a specific issue. Again, sort of reliability check. We talked about this in the questionnaire lecture last time. So, especially for coding, if you have multiple coders, reliability would mean, so for example, intercoder reliability. There would be different coders, different researchers come to the same conclusions. So if you go through coding some data, for example, transcribed text, ideally multiple researchers come to the same conclusions and to the same sort of coding results. If that's the case, you can be quite happy and quite confident then that you have a certain degree of reliability and a high degree of reliability. If it doesn't happen, then you have to sort of see why and where potential issues are, and then you either discuss this with the other coders and then go through the data again. So if you come to different results, then there's a potential problem. Well, in either sort of intra-coder reliability, there would be you yourself. What can happen sometimes that you, through going through different cases of different participants, your coding probably might vary as well to some extent, and this should be sort of reflected upon as well as much as possible, and try to reflect on it and try to keep it as reliable and constant as possible. Reporting the results. So that's our last slide for today. There's a lot more flexibility, I guess, in reporting the results rather than from reporting statistics, because, well, reporting statistics, there's sort of a certain way that sort of you have to report the results. For qualitative analysis, there's a lot more flexibility in reporting the results because, well, there's more flexibility in the data in some extent as well. But what can be quite important is to be as clear as possible. Well, quite simple. Instead of saying like most people found touch interaction easy, it's better than rather than that. It's better to say like, oh, well, 7 out of 10 found touch interaction easy. Now, because that just gives you more and the reader more information and a better idea what most means. Sometimes, if you read most, it's one way of a researcher, potentially trying to make the data look better than they are. But it's always be as specific as possible, as clear as possible. And it can be quite helpful as well to include direct quotes from the respondents. So rather than people preferred interface A, include direct quotes when it's like, oh, hey, interface A was really good because it sort of allowed me to accomplish my task a lot easier. So that's quite a common thing to do and quite a good thing to do to give the reader sort of a more direct understanding of what people thought about your system. Cool. So that was it for today and for the lectures in general, I guess. So for assignment this week, just